How long will it take for me to sponsor a vet for a work visa here in the United States? That is a question that we get a lot of times from prospective employers looking to hire vets for their animal hospital. And that's a valid question. That is what we're talking about today in today's episode of Live at Lunch with me, Emily Sumner of Sumner Immigration Law. So that's a valid question. How long is it going to take? And other key questions, because you might be open to potentially sponsoring a vet or other professional. Everything that we're talking about today really applies to any number of different professions in the United States. But the question is, how long is it going to take to process the visa? What documentation do you need? That type of question. So that's what we're talking about today. The answer to those critical questions, which are completely valid questions, the answer is it depends. So it depends on a number of factors. We're going to talk today about the possibility of sponsoring a vet in several different visa classifications that are commonly used for veterinarians here in the United States. So the first visa classification we're talking about is the H-1B visa classification. And again, the answer is it depends, because it depends on what the person's current immigration status is. It is possible, if you find a candidate who is working in a valid H-1B status right now for another hospital, for example, another vet hospital, it is possible to transfer that H-1B status to your particular vet hospital. The process of filing that transfer paperwork is a set of paperwork. It's not just a matter of notifying USCIS, writing them a letter and saying, hey, this person is changing their visa classification to this employer. There's a specific set of paperwork that has to be submitted to USCIS before the vet can begin working at the new hospital. However, that process is pretty streamlined. Relatively speaking, it can happen pretty quickly. So the H-1B transfer process for a veterinarian here in the United States, or another profession that holds H-1B status, is that, of course, there has to be a job offer from the new employer. Once there's a job offer in place, the immigration attorney that you're working with will ask you for some information about the company, about the hospital, and we will need information from the individual foreign national. Once we have the required basic information, we will prepare what's called the LCA, also known as the labor condition application, that has to be filed with the Department of Labor. It takes at least a week for that to be certified. And in the meantime, we can prepare the rest of the paperwork that's required. So that's a set of forms, something called an H-1B support letter, supporting documentation from both the hospital and from the foreign national. And we walk employers through this step by step to streamline it as much as possible. We know that processing immigration paperwork is not a full-time job for anyone at the hospital. That's what we're here for. So we ask for the required information, and then we walk you through step by step, do as much as we can for you to support you in the process. So as far as the timeline for an H-1B transfer, like I said, it takes about a week for that LCA, labor condition application, to be certified. And in the meantime, we prepare the other paperwork. So really realistically, from the time you begin the H-1B preparation process to the time that the new employee prospective hire is able to start working at your hospital will likely be a couple of weeks, probably at least a minimum of a week, right? Because that's how long it takes the LCA to be processed. But realistically, probably 2 weeks from the time we start to the time that that person's able to start working at the vet hospital. The reason that I say it's a couple weeks is, like I said, it is a process. We have to file a set of paperwork, specific paperwork and documentation with USCIS. It's important to know that if your candidate is working in valid H-1B status right now and they're filing an H-1B transfer from employer A to your particular hospital, that the vet can begin working as soon as USCIS receives the petition. That means you don't have to wait for the petition to be approved. You don't even have to wait for a receipt notice from USCIS. That person can begin working and you can complete the I-9 as long as you have proof that USCIS has received the petition. So for that, we use FedEx tracking, for example. So the timeline, again, for an H-1B transfer is probably realistically at least a couple of weeks, and really not much longer than that, from the time you begin the process to the time that they're able to begin working. So that's amazing. Again, it depends, right? So it depends on what their current immigration status is. If you have a prospective employee who is not currently in H-1B status, and we'll talk about other statuses in just a minute, but if you have somebody who's not in H-1B status right now, but has held H-1B status previously, and they've been counted against the H-1B cap, which is an annual numerical limitation that applies to the H-1B classification. So if you have somebody who was previously counted against the cap, but maybe they are here in H-4 status right now, which is a dependent of H-1B, or another visa classification, maybe they're working here on L-2, which is another dependent classification. You don't have to worry about which classification they're in. Just know that if they, and these are questions we will ask, prospective candidates, just know that if they are working in the United States, or just are in, not even working, but in the United States in a different visa classification, they will have to change status or leave the United States and come back, get a visa stamped and come back. But if they're looking to change status to H-1B, then typically we would use premium processing for that. Premium processing is when we meaning the client, pays an additional $2,805 to the US government to process the petition within 15 calendar days. By that, I mean either USCIS will approve the petition or issue a request for evidence within 15 business days. I might have said calendar days a minute ago. It's business days, within 15 business days. So this process, my point is, this process could potentially will take likely a bit longer, because if a person is not already in valid H-1B status, we have to wait for that change of status request to be approved before they can begin working in the United States. The third H-1B situation is if a person has never held H-1B status before. So that might be a situation where you have a foreign national student or recent grad who is working for the hospital on OPT, which is optional practical training, or perhaps STEM OPT, which is similar, but it's for individuals who have a certain field of study and they qualify for an additional 2 years of OPT. But it could be somebody who is working for you now in OPT as a recent graduate of a university here in the United States, or it could be a vet who is currently outside of the United States. So if that's the case, if they've never held H-1B status before and they've never been counted against the H-1B cap before, they will have to be registered in the H-1B lottery. The H-1B lottery is held every year in March. So good timing if you're watching this now in the late February of 2025. But it's held in March. This year, the H-1B registration process will open on March 7th. So a week from this coming Friday, it will open, and it will be open for a couple of weeks. So if that happens, the process is going to take longer. That you may, and by that I mean you register them, then the applicant, or rather the employer, can file the H-1B petition if you're selected. You can file the H-1B petition between April 1st and June 30th. And then the person can't begin working in H-1B status until October 1st. So if you have a candidate who's overseas, that is going to be a bit of a longer term commitment from the time you start the process to the time they're able to come to the United States and begin working here in the United States. However, it may be worth it, right, to fill that position that you haven't been able to fill for however long. The other thing to keep in mind is if the foreign national is in the United States working right now on optional practical training, that OPT or STEM OPT, it's very likely, not guaranteed, depending on the situation, and we can talk through the facts and advise you on this, but it is entirely possible that they would be able to continue working without interruption, even if their OPT is going to end sometime in the summer, or sometime between the end of between April and October 1st. So again, fact specific, but it's entirely likely that they would be able to continue working without interruption, which would be amazing. So we're going to move on to other visa classifications. Again, talking about how long it takes to process these visas. In other words, how quickly can you get that vet into your practice and working from the time that you make an offer and begin to figure out the immigration steps, which is what we are here for. So another commonly used visa classification for vets, and again, as I said earlier, all of this applies to other professions. Not every profession or occupation, rather, is eligible for the H-1B or the TN or these other classifications we're talking about, but vets definitely are, and a lot of other occupations are as well. So for the TN, another commonly used visa classification for vets, the TN is for citizens of Canada or Mexico. And again, it depends. The question of how long they can or how soon they can begin working. One question is, where are they right now? And are they Canadian or are they Mexican citizens? If they are Canadian citizens, they can, and let's say they're in Canada, they can apply for the TN status at the port of entry. And that's something that can be done pretty quickly. We've had vets rather start from Canada within a week or so because we've been able to pull everything together. They've applied at the port of entry, and then they've been able to enter and begin working in the United States. So it can be pretty quick for Canadian vets. If the vet that you're talking about is in Mexico, if they are a Mexican national, they have to apply for a visa at the US consulate in Mexico before they're able to enter the United States. That process, if you just go, let's say that you are beginning this process right now and you go onto the website and try to schedule an interview, it could be a good 4 to 6 months before the person is able to get an interview at a US consulate in Mexico for the TN visa application. However, keep the faith. Almost always our clients are able to get that appointment moved up. They keep looking and the consulate will open spaces throughout the months as they become available. And almost always our clients are able to get an appointment much quicker if they keep looking for open slots. So it's not the end of the world. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a full 6 months. Once they have that visa interview, typically the visa is issued within about a week or two, and then they're able to enter the United States and begin working. If you have a candidate who is in the United States in valid TN status right now, that is a different situation, right? So they may, depending on the situation, to change employers, they may go to the port of entry if they're Canadian and re-enter. If they are Mexican, there's a process that's in the Foreign Affairs manual that says that they can go to the border, the port of entry, to process and practice. That's hit or miss. But just know it's possible, whether they are Canadian or Mexican, it's possible for them to process potentially outside of the United States, and that can be pretty quick. Or they can file a change of employer here in the United States. And that's something that we've done a number of times for vets in TN status here in the United States. For whatever reason, they don't want to or can't travel outside of the United States, and we're able to file with USCIS. Again, it's a set of paperwork that we file with USCIS, and it does have to be approved before they can begin working for the new employer. That's different from the H-1B classification, but it is possible to do that. If you pay premium for premium processing, again, that's that additional fee of $2,805, then USCIS will approve the petition or issue a request for evidence within 15 business days. The other commonly used visa classification for vets that we see a lot is the E3 and the H1B1. The E3 is for citizens of Australia. The H1B1 is for citizens of Chile and Singapore. So both of those classifications, again, the answer is it depends on how quickly are you going to be able to get a vet here and begin working in the United States. But for both of those visa classifications, you do have to have what's called an LCA, a labor condition application, which is the same documentation, the same form that I referred to for the H-1B, that first visa classification I was talking about, and it takes about a week to be certified. So you have that step, and you have to have the interview scheduled at the US consulate if they're overseas to get the H-1B1 or E3 visa stamped. That depends on how busy the consulates are, of course, but typically there's not a long wait for that. One thing to keep in mind is that, not to get too much into the weeds, but in the past there has been a visa interview waiver program where the Department of State has not required interviews for certain candidates, certain people who are applying for a visa, and that's made the processing more or less faster than it was before that particular program, and now they're tightening those requirements. So it is possible that the wait for a visa appointment will be longer than it has been in the recent past, but we'll keep you posted on that. But even so, it's not a wait of months and months and months. It could be a wait of potentially a month or two, maybe even less, depending on the particular consulate and how busy they are. So you have that LCA certified. Again, that takes about a week. You have the interview. After the interview, usually the clients receive the visa within a week or two, and then they're able to enter the United States and begin working. As with the H-1B and the TN visa classifications, it is possible that you would have a candidate here in the United States who is working for another company on the E3 or the H-1B1 classification. And similar to the TN, it is possible to file that change of employer with USCIS. One thing to keep in mind is premium processing is not available for every visa classification. So that's something you want to take a look at. And may be part of your strategic decision and planning with your immigration attorney about whether you have this person apply from outside of the United States or travel and re-enter. But my point is just know that it's a matter of months. Really, of these 3 or 4 visa classifications that we are talking about, really the one that is going to be the longest time frame is the H-1B if the person has never held H-1B status before and they have to go through that H-1B lottery process, the registration process, be selected in the lottery, and then file. And again, that's a process that is happening in March, and then the person would be able to begin working October 1st. Otherwise, for the H-1B or for TN or E3 or H-1B1, it really can be a matter of a couple of weeks to a month or 2 from the time you begin to the time they're able to begin working. Again, that's all subject to depending on what their current immigration status is, and that's something that we can help you assess and come up with a strategic plan with a realistic timeline when we have that information. So I hope that you have found this information helpful on how long it will take more or less to sponsor a foreign national vet to work in the United States. One thing that we did not talk about as part of this process is the licensure process. Of course, vets have to be licensed in the United States, and that is another factor outside of US immigration that will affect when they can begin working in the United States. So that's, of course, another factor to take into considerations or into consideration. A lot of times, if the vet has graduated from an AVMA accredited school, it's less of an issue, but it's something to keep in mind as well. So I hope that you have found this information helpful. As I said, this information, I've talked a lot about vets and vet hospitals and vet clinics, but this information applies to a number of different professions. So if you're looking to hire a software engineer or an accountant or any number of other professional positions, meaning ones that require a minimum of a bachelor's degree in a specific field of study to begin working, and there are other requirements as well, but just know that this applies to multiple types of professions, not just vets. I hope that if you found this information helpful, you will share it with a friend or a colleague. I hope you will subscribe to this platform so you don't miss our next video. We will be back next week for Live at Lunch. Until then, my name is Emily Sumner with Sumner Immigration Law, serving clients throughout the United States and around the world with employment-based and family-based immigration matters. Until next time.